NVIDIA's GeForce RTX 5090 and 5080 graphics cards are here, and in this video we'll share everything we think gamers need to know to make an informed buying decision. We'll highlight the key new features and compare the 50 series cards against their predecessors from the 40 and the 30 series, plus we'll advise on what to look out for when upgrading. We'll also be releasing dedicated videos outlining what these cards offer content creators and AI developers. So here's what's new in 50 series. The 5090 and 5080 are the first two consumer graphics cards based on the Blackwell architecture. This builds on the ray tracing and upscaling focus over the last few generations of NVIDIA GPUs, using generative AI to dramatically increase frame rates. This is necessary as the combination of ray tracing being so ludicrously demanding and the death, or at least near death, of Moore's law is making it impossible to design and build GPUs that solely rely on traditional rasterized rendering. This means the focus of Blackwell isn't solely on more cores and higher frequencies, it's on unleashing the power of AI to drive performance. This change in priority is revealed by the on-paper performance, with the flagship 5090 only having 28% faster shading, but a game-changing 66% faster ray tracing and 154% more AI performance. That extra performance comes from a number of new technologies and rendering techniques known as neural rendering. Now, whilst neural rendering itself isn't new, first being used in Turing-based 20 series GPUs to upscale games using DLSS 1, Blackwell-based 50 series introduces neural shaders, fundamentally changing how games are rendered. And this is potentially as big a deal for gaming as a switch from a fixed function pipeline to programmable shaders was in GeForce 3 GPUs way back in 2001. The sea change is that in addition to upscaling, the neural shaders in 50 series use pre-trained transformer models to create entirely new frames, essentially filling in the blanks between rasterized frames, accelerating the frame rate well beyond what the CUDA cores and RT cores could achieve alone. Where gaming is concerned, the neural shaders enable the new DLSS 4 to generate 3 frames for every rendered frame, a process known as multi-frame generation. Combined with upscaling the original frame, in effect, 15 out of 16 pixels are generated rather than rendered. NVIDIA claims the combination of these techniques boost frame rates by up to 8 times, something we've put to the test later on in this video, so make sure you keep watching. A side benefit of this move to neural rendering is reduced memory usage, freeing up this valuable resource for more complex game worlds. As already mentioned, DLSS 4 uses transformer-based models to generate entirely new frames with improved ray reconstruction. These are a type of neural network that learn context and relationships between sequence components to transform an input sequence into an output sequence and need to be pre-trained on a massive AI supercomputer at NVIDIA. This boosts both performance and image quality over previous versions of DLSS, which use more primitive CNN-based models, reducing noise and ghosting around objects. DLSS 4 with multi-frame generation is already supported by 75 games and applications, including big hitters such as Alan Wake 2, Cyberpunk 2077, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and Star Wars Outlaws, with no doubt more to follow. And if DLSS 4 isn't to your liking, it's entirely optional and can be enabled and disabled at will in the NVIDIA app within Windows. Now, we were curious about the gaming experience and image quality implications of DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation. You can see what the performance is like later on in this video, but in terms of image quality, we found that the new transformer-based model generates far better looking frames and models than the previous CNN model. The latter is particularly important, as whilst DLSS 3 was pretty good at upscaling, fast-moving objects quite often suffered from a fair amount of ghosting. With DLSS 4, this ghosting is largely a thing of the past. As if changing how games are rendered wasn't enough, 50 series also features Reflex 2 to drive down latency. The original Reflex achieved this by synchronizing the CPU and GPU, boosting responsiveness and aiming accuracy in first-person shooters. Reflex 2 adds a technique called frame warp that captures mouse movements after the frame has been rendered. The original frame is then shifted according to this movement and re-rendered by AI accordingly, giving a more accurate visual of where your mouse is moving. Reflex 2 will be available soon on all RTX GPUs, but will be supported first by 50 series cards in games such as the Finals and Valorant. Now let's compare the 5090 and 5080 with the most popular graphics cards from the last couple of generations. Now, before diving into the benchmarks, here's the spec of the 3XS system that we used to test these graphics cards. It had an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X 3D processor, 32GB of Corsair DDR5 RAM, an Asus ROG Strix X870 motherboard, Corsair MP700 Pro SSD and Corsair 1200W PSU running Windows 11. We measured the average frame rate in multiple games, testing all the highest quality settings, starting with rasterized graphics with ray tracing enabled, and then 3 types of DLSS: super resolution, frame generation, and multi-frame generation. Now, the reason for including so many configurations is so you can understand how performance improves with different DLSS versions, so that you can choose which mode is right for you. NVIDIA claims that the Blackwell-based 5090 offers twice the performance of its predecessor, at least in games that support MFG in DLSS 4. This means that in unsupported games, the 5090 is reliant on having 33% more cores than the 4090, plus more and faster memory at its disposal. Compared to the 3090, the 5090 has double the cores and again more and faster memory. So let's see how these 3 GPUs compare in the real world. The first game we benchmarked was Alan Wake 2, in which all cards failed to deliver a smooth frame rate of above 60 FPS at 4K in traditional rasterized mode. Despite this, the 5090 did prove 36% faster than the 4090 and an incredible 275% faster than the 3090. This higher base performance combined with multi-frame generation enabled the 5090 to achieve silky smooth frame rates well above 200 FPS even at 4K. In contrast, the 4090 could only just break 100 FPS with its standard frame generation with inferior image quality. That works out as 127% performance increase gen on gen, plus better image quality. At the less demanding 1440p resolution, it's a similar story, with super resolution still being required to achieve a smooth frame rate. Still, it would be a shame to run such an expensive graphics card such as the 5090 at 1440p, so just turn on MFG and whack up the resolution to 4K. The next game we benchmarked was Cyberpunk 2077, which also proved very challenging for all the cards with the overdrive preset, with even the 5090 staggering along at just 33 FPS in traditional rasterized mode at 4K. However, this is enough base performance that when combined with either super resolution, you can get 96 FPS, or multi-frame generation, you can get up to 259 FPS. In contrast, the 4090 could only achieve a smooth frame rate of 73 FPS with super resolution or 118 FPS with multi-frame generation. The 3090 struggles even more in Cyberpunk with just 39 FPS, the best it can achieve with super resolution enabled. You really need to run the game at 1440p to get above 60 FPS. At the less demanding 1440p resolution, a similar story, with some form of DLSS being required to achieve a smooth frame rate on all the cards. The third game we benchmarked was Star Wars Outlaws, which also proved very challenging for all the cards with path tracing enabled, with even the 5090 juddering along at just 25 FPS in traditional rasterized mode at 4K. Even with super resolution enabled, you get a barely playable 68 FPS. However, with multi-frame generation enabled, you can get as much as 210 FPS, far more satisfactory frame rates. In contrast, the 4090 could only achieve a smooth frame rate of 95 FPS with its frame generation, and there's no way to get a smooth frame rate on a 3090 in Outlaws, even dropping the resolution to 1440p. You really do need to upgrade your GPU to enjoy this game. The final game we benchmarked was Hogwarts Legacy, which also proved very challenging for all of the cards. with only the 5090 achieving a smooth frame rate of 82 FPS in traditional rasterized mode at 4K. Enabling super resolution, this shoots up to 198 FPS and then 463 FPS with multi-frame generation enabled, close to double the performance of the 4090 at its best. In contrast, the only way to get a smooth frame rate on a 3090 in Hogwarts Legacy is by enabling super resolution. As with Star Wars Outlaws, you really do need to upgrade your GPU to enjoy this game at 4K. So surely there must be a downside to all of this extra performance. Well, the trade-off is of course a higher TDP and a need for a significantly larger PSU, at least 1000 watt for a 5090 compared to 850 watt for a 4090 or 750 watt for a 3090. The graph you're now viewing shows how much power each GPU consumes, not the total system power consumption, with the 5090 clearly leading the field. On average, the 5090 consumes 42% more power than the 4090 and delivers between 36% more and double the performance. Unlike previous generation GPUs, which were all about brute rendering performance, the 5090 takes a different approach, using AI-accelerated techniques to upscale and generate entirely new frames to achieve smooth frame rates. Whatever your preference for rasterized or generated frames, realistically, this is the only way to go to get smooth frame rates, as it's not realistic to build a gaming GPU with 100,000 CUDA cores for a reasonable price and less than 2 kilowatt power draw. This is simply the way that frames are going to be created going forwards, with AI enabling NVIDIA to create a dual-slot graphics card with less than 575 watts power draw. Even NVIDIA's competitors are going down this route too, albeit at a much slower rate of development. So, having tested the 3 GPUs across 4 different games, the conclusion for 3090 owners is clear. If you want to get a smooth frame rate at the highest detail settings, you need a 5090, providing a 275% more performance boost in rasterized games and over 900% in MFG-enabled games. However, we do appreciate that thanks to inflation, the 5090 is around £500 more expensive than the 3090 was at launch. So if your budget can't quite stretch to a 5090, the 5080 is also a very attractive upgrade. For 4090 owners, the 5090 is also a compelling upgrade, although of course there is less of a performance difference. Even so, we saw across multiple games that you can double the frame rate by switching to a 5090 with MFG enabled, although it's only 36% faster in rasterized games. It's also worth bearing in mind that unlike previous versions of DLSS, which had limited game support, there are already 75 titles that support MFG, so it really does look like game developers are on board with supporting DLSS 4. Keep watching to find out about the 5090's little brother, the 5080, plus useful information on what to look out for when upgrading your graphics card. Then you can follow the links in the description to scan.co.uk to view the full range of 5090 graphics cards and gaming PCs from 3XS Systems. NVIDIA claims that the Blackwell-based 5080 offers twice the performance of its predecessor, at least in games that support multi-frame generation in DLSS 4. This means that in unsupported games, the 5080 is heavily reliant on having just 11% more cores than the 4080, although it does have faster memory. Compared to the 3080, the 5080 has 24% more cores and again more and faster memory. Now let's see how these GPUs compare though in the real world. For the benchmarks, we chose the 10 rather than the 12GB version of the 3080, as it was by far the most popular version. We benchmarked the same 4 games on the 80-level cards, starting with Alan Wake 2, in which no cards manage a smooth frame rate in traditional rasterized mode, even at 1440p. What's more, the 5080 only proved 20% faster than the 4080, although it is a gobsmacking 800% faster than the 3080. Ultimately, to see the full benefits of the 5080, you need to enable MFG, at which point you'll see a 1,105% performance lead over the poor old 3080. At the less demanding 1440p resolution, it's a similar story, with multi-frame generation still being required to achieve a smooth frame rate. The next game we benchmarked was Cyberpunk 2077, also proving very challenging for all cards with ray tracing only. Even the 5080 only just managed a smooth 60 FPS with super resolution enabled at 4K or 74 FPS at 1440p. However, you can increase the frame rate to 173 and 220 FPS respectively with MFG enabled. This compares very well to the 4080, which only managed a smooth frame rate of 89 and 114 FPS with its frame generation enabled. The 3080, even with super resolution, simply can't run Cyberpunk smoothly at these settings. Star Wars Outlaws also proved very challenging for all the cards with path tracing enabled, with none of the cards managing a smooth frame rate at 4K with traditional rasterized graphics. Even with FG enabled, the 5080 only got 75 FPS, needing MFG to achieve a silky smooth 134 FPS. In contrast, the best the 4090 can produce is 69 FPS with FG, whilst the 3080 lags behind with a jerky 23 FPS. Both the 5080 and 4080 can produce a smooth frame rate at 1440p with either FG or MFG enabled, but once again the 3080 simply cannot cope with Outlaws at the highest quality settings. And the final game we benchmarked was Hogwarts Legacy, which also proved really challenging for all the cards, with the 5080 needing super resolution to achieve a smooth frame rate of 138 FPS, 189 FPS with FG at 4K, and an amazing 303 FPS with multi-frame generation. The 4080 wasn't too far behind, with 121 FPS with super resolution and 168 FPS with frame generation. Meanwhile, the 3080 was able to render at 82 FPS with super resolution, the only game we tested that it could play smoothly at 4K. Given the 4K results, it should come as no surprise that as long as you enable super resolution, all three GPUs were able to play Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p smoothly. Like with the 5090, the trade-off for all this extra performance is a higher TDP and a need for a slightly larger PSU, at least 850 watt for a 5080 compared to 750 watt for a 4080 or 3080. And like earlier, this graph shows how much power each GPU consumes, not the total system power consumption, with the 5080 clearly leading the field. On average, the 5080 only consumes a little more power than the 4080, but is between 20 and 183% faster and much, much faster than the 3080. As already discussed in our conclusion for the 5090, the 50 series Blackwell GPUs rely heavily on multi-frame generation to deliver higher performance than their predecessors. Given the engineering challenges of making ever more capable graphics cards, this switch towards AI-accelerated gaming is inevitable. The 5080 leans even more on MFG than the 5090, as it has relatively fewer additional cores over its predecessors. In games that don't support MFG, this means you're looking at around a 20% performance uplift over the 4080. However, with MFG enabled, the 5080 leaps ahead by as much as 183%. The performance gap is far wider versus the 3080, especially given the increase in memory size, with the 5080 leading by up to 800% in rasterized games and over 1,000% in MFG-enabled games. In both cases, given the relatively small increase in power draw and price, the 5080 is a very compelling upgrade. Now, whilst the process of upgrading graphics cards is normally very straightforward, it is crucial to make sure that your system is ready to support your new purchase. Let's start with the most important components, the PSU, without which your new graphics card won't even power up. The 5090 TDP of 575 watt means it requires a minimum 1000 watt PSU with 4 8-pin PCIe power cables or one 16-pin 600 watt PCIe 5 power cable. In contrast, the RTX's 5080's TDP of 360 watt means it requires a minimum 850 watt PSU with 3 8-pin PCIe power cables or one 16-pin 450 watt PCIe 5 power cable. It's important to remember that graphics cards manufacturers are free to go above and beyond these requirements with overclock cards, so do make sure to check the individual card specs to ensure compatibility. We recommend the following Corsair PSUs as they have the new 600 watt PCIe 5 power cables, RME, RMX and RMX Shift 750 watt and above, or HX1 1000 watts and above. Where the 5090 and 5080 are nowhere near as big as the pre-release rumours had it, they are still quite large cards, so it's really important to make sure that they fit in your case. You'd be gutted if you ordered one and found it wouldn't. The 5090 and 5080 Founders Edition cards are all two-slot designs with a height of 137mm and length of 304mm. For other manufacturers of RTX 50 series graphics cards, you'll need to check their specs for size, as the dimensions will most likely be different to the Founders Edition cards. In terms of CPU, we wouldn't recommend pairing a 5090 or 5080 with anything more than a few generations old. So for example, you'd need an AMD Ryzen 5000 series or Intel 12th generation or above. And this is even more important if you're considering a 5090, as the last thing you want to do is bottleneck your shiny new £2,000 worth of graphics card with a geriatric CPU. Similarly, although a 5090 and 5080 will in theory work in any PCIe motherboard with a free 16X slot, we wouldn't recommend anything older than PCIe 4. So to wrap up, NVIDIA's GeForce RTX 50 series GPUs mark the beginning of a new era of AI-generated graphics, with the 5090 and 5080 capable, in the right conditions, of double the performance of 40 series and over 10 times the performance over 30 series GPUs. We hope you found this buyer's guide on the new cards useful. Make sure to follow the links in the description below to our website scan.co.uk to browse the full range of 5090 and 5080 graphics cards in gaming PCs built by 3XS Systems. And once you've got your hands on a 5090 or 5080, we would love to hear how you're getting on, so make sure you leave us a comment below.